Hi, guys. Welcome back to another episode of the Get Your Popcorn podcast. I'm your host, Holly Holiday. Thank you so much for your patience. This is, of course, coming out a day late because I've had a very busy weekend I guess I don't really talk about it on here too much, but I'm a competitive bodybuilder and I was busy this weekend competing. And then training at nationals this weekend, which is pretty crazy. I won my PNBA pro card, so it's like just a crazy week, and I just needed a couple of days to recover. Normally, I record on Sundays, but that was not happening. We're doing our conclusion to our Gone with the Wind series. If you're just tuning into this episode specifically, please go back and check out the making of as well as part one. I deep dive a lot more about everything. Of course, Gone with the Wind's got a very complicated history, and I go into all of that there as well as the series from last year. I revisit this film quite a bit. So I'll do my best to discuss the really problematic elements of this film and its book with as much care as I can. But obviously, this has like great levels of historical rewriting, racism, harmful stereotypes, a glorification of the Ku Klux Klan, as well as the Confederacy. So this is terrible. So where we left off with our characters at the end, I'll just do a quick recap. Brett has gone off to join the Confederate Army. Ashley is been captured by the Yankees. Melanie has just given birth to her baby Bo. She's not doing well. Scarlett has gotten Melanie, Prissy, and the baby back to Tara. Tara has been kind of decimated by the Yankees, who are using it as kind of a headquarters for a while. Her father has kind of got insane with grief because her mother has died. A lot of the enslaved people have run away, except for Mammy and Pork, who have been introduced. He's only in a little bit at the beginning, but he is one of the enslaved men on the property. So the title card goes, "And the wind swept through Georgia. Sherman, a reddish and flaming swirling montage of Sherman's troops, visualizes the march through Georgia, leaving behind him a path of destruction 60 miles wide from Atlanta to the sea. Life at Tara is one of deprivation, poverty, and hard work." So then we open up to the fields, and Scarlett and her sisters are the ones working the fields and picking cotton, attempting to kind of grow back and repair what they had. Obviously, it's a much smaller scale in order to pay the taxes on Tara. Now, they don't go into this as much in the book, but there is a family called the Slatterys that are poor white trash, and they pick their own cotton, and the entire county like looks down on them. And now these girls are picking cotton like the Slatterys and are like horrified for themselves. Particularly Scarlett's sister Sue Ellen, who is like, I've talked about her before, she's complains the entire time. She's like absolutely insufferable. And she's very angry and doesn't want to do it. And Scarlett slaps the shit out of her because Sue Ellen says she hates Tara and she doesn't care. This is where we see the theme that we discussed earlier in part one, that Gerald says anybody with a drop of Irish blood in them loves the land like their mother, because Scarlett says the line, "How dare you say that? Hating Tara is like hating mom and pa." Melanie is very, very helpless and sick. They don't really discuss why in the book too much. I don't think there's like a terribly great understanding of it, other than she, doesn't do well with a birth. And this is compared a lot to Scarlett, who at this point has had a child with no issues and can't understand what Melanie is complaining about in the book, but this isn't shown in the movie. The women in the county, besides Scarlett and her family, kind of all go off to other families to kind of live off of. Of course, this is a time where women are not working, especially aristocratic women. And so they have like their like option is like kind of go and live off these other family members or starve to death, or at least that's what they think their option is. There's a character in the book called Grandma Fontaine, who is kind of the only one. She kind of despises Scarlett, but sort of respects her for like holding her ground. And as this is happening, there is a deserter, which is sort of a rogue Yankee soldier who has come back to rob the house. And he comes in and starts rummaging through the stuff, including Ellen's jewelry, which is, of course, very important to Scarlett. He points a gun at her, and she still has Rhett's pistol that he gave her when they parted ways. He approaches her, and she sort of presumably, obviously, probably correctly, that he's going to harm her or rape her. She shoots him in the face. Now, this is a huge theme in the book, is this fear of rape. They talk about it a lot. The women, they're scared of the Yankees doing it. They're scared of the free slaves doing it. They talk about it a lot. It's like a women's safety and the risk that they have. Basically, because Gerald is pretty useless at this point. Like, he's not going to protect them from anything. Like, it's pretty much Scarlett is like the head of household and the only protection that they have. So this fear of rape is like so huge. And like, as we know, with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan will happen later in the book. And this is sort of the beginnings of it. We start to hear the whispers of the Klan. This is often something that they will use as an excuse. A lot of false claims were made in order to lynch Black men and, false vigilante justice that took place. So there's a lot of talk about this. And then there's a lot of discussion when we see the Ku Klux Klan start to rise up in the book a little bit later in the film, that this is a justification for what they're doing. Obviously, now we know that that is bullshit and not true. And no one race is, more likely to do anything than the other. And that's horrible, horrible, horrible. So many Black men lost their lives to false accusations. But this is a discussion, of course, this is historical rewriting. We discussed how racist this film and book are, but I do have to bring that up because this is this like ongoing theme. So all of the family hear the gunshot go off and they start to come running. This is where we see Melanie, totally weak, kind of poke her head out the window and lie. And say that the gun went off when it was being cleaned. And this is where the moment where Scarlett kind of has a very small glimmer of respect for Melanie, because this is the first time she's seen Melanie have like any sort of gumption at all. And she's like kind of admires her for being like such a cool liar. So of course the punishment for murder would be the two of them would be hanged. So two of them use Melanie's nightgown to drag him into the yard and bury him. The end of the war comes in 1865 with Leigh's surrender of the South. The Southern defeat obviously then means that Ashley will be coming home. And Scarlett, instead of kind of celebrating the end of the war, is just sort of focused on the fact that they can plant more cotton and hopefully with the war ending that the cotton prices will go up because there'll be demand for it. And then we have another title card. So there's a few different terms that come up. There's carpetbaggers and scallywags. And so carpetbaggers are Yankees from the North who come in to kind of, quote unquote, exploit the Southerners following the war to make their money. So there's not any sort of respect for them whatsoever. Tara, because of Melanie, essentially becomes sort of a refugee camp because it's on the road back to Atlanta, sort of the main road, and it's one of the only plantations still standing. Scarlett hates this, but Melanie sort of insists because she says, I'm hoping that somebody else is doing this for Ashley on his way back to me. Frank Kennedy, who we met at 12 Oaks, this is the guy that is with Sue Ellen, comes and stays and asks Scarlett for her hand in marriage. But he says, I want to make a name for myself and then I will come back and propose. Then we have the return of Ashley. And one day we see sort of a man stumbling up the driveway. Scarlett's like, oh God, another hungry mouth. And Melanie sort of clutches her throat and begins to run down. They realize that it is Ashley. And there's that like classic shot of them running into, towards each other. And we see Melanie with her arms out, then Ashley and Melanie and Ashley. You see this like kind of parodied in a lot of like cartoons and films later on down the line, but that's where that shot is from. Scarlett has to be physically restrained from Mammy, who reminds her that he is actually Melanie's husband. Ashley sort of then becomes, like he's then put to work by Scarlett. But it's very clear that like Ashley was like not cut out for this line of work and labor, comes, like I've said in the previous ones, she's like extremely aristocratic, like very intellectual family, despite the fact that they marry their own cousins, very like literature driven, politics, like very in his head. And he sort of feels like he's like very defeated. It's very clear that he is, which is the opposite of Scarlett, who faces things head on. She's like, whatever comes at Scarlett, she's like, I trust that I will deal with it. He says to her, she comes down to visit him where he's splitting wood in the woodshed. And he said, life is becoming too real, losing all the beauty of that life that I loved. And now I find myself in a world which for me is worse than death, a world where there is no place for me. And Scarlett is tired and she wants to escape. And so she says, I do want to escape, but I'm so tired of it all. The South is dead. It's dead. And the Yankees and the carpetbaggers, they've got it all. And there's nothing left for us. Scarlett then reminds Ashley that she still loves him and begs him to run away to Mexico. But Ashley says, after he kisses her, I can't do that. I have a wife and child. Like, I'm not going to leave. And she says, take me away. There's nothing to keep us here. And Ashley says, nothing except honor. And he says, there is something you love better than me, although you may not know it. And that's when he puts a clump of dirt from Tara in his hands. And he says, Tara. And she says, yes, I still have this. You needn't go. I won't have you all starve simply because I threw myself at your head, and it won't happen again. She turns away and she goes to return, back to the house, and just is like absolutely heartbroken. And like, Ashley, you motherfucker. Like, he leads her on this entire movie. And like, yeah, she's like a little delulu because like he is married with a wife and baby. So like we'll also like unpack that that's like pretty egregious. However, like, it's not like actually, like, he will, like, kiss her and then shut it down, or, like, say he loves all these qualities about her and then kind of shut it down, but he never fully shuts it down, and he's always fine to, like, kind of openly flirt with her. So, like, Ashley's at fault for this. I blame the man. When in doubt, blame the man. And as she comes back, she's still got this clump of dirt in her hands, and the old overseer of Tara comes up the driveway, and he wants to buy Tara. And he's, a carpetbagger. He's like come in to sort of exploit the South. And he is now married to that girl, the Slattery's, Amy Slattery. And it was actually her family that got Ellen sick when she died. So Scarlett fucking hates her. 1, because she thinks she's white trash. 2, because she blames this family for her mother's death. And Scarlett says, why, it's Amy Slattery. And she says, yes, it's me. Scarlett says, stop. And Wilkerson, the overseer, says, you haven't forgotten about your overseer, huh? Well, Miss Emmy is now Mrs. Wilkerson. Scarlett says, get off those steps, you trashy wench. Get off this land. Side note, like, how much would you love to call a bitch you hate a trashy wench? Like, I don't know when this, like, insult went out of style, but petition to bring back trashy wench for just, like, bitches you hate. We'll get back to it. Jonas Wilkerson says, you can't speak to my wife that way. And Scarlett says, wife, high time you made her your wife. Who baptized your other brats after you killed my mother? And Wilkerson says, we came here to pay a friendly call to talk business with some old friends. Scarlett says, friends? When were we ever friends with the like of you? And Wilkerson says, still high and mighty, ain't you? Well, I know about you. I know your father's turned idiot and you can't pay your taxes. And I've come here to make a right good offer. And me's hankering to live here. And Scarlett says, get off this place, you dirty Yankee. And Wilkerson says, you bog-trotting, high-flying Irish will find out who's running things around here when you get sold up for the taxes, and I'll buy this place lock, stock, and barrel, and I'll live in it. But I'll wait for the sheriff's sale. And Scarlett still caught this clump of dirt in her hand, and she throws it in his face. And she says, that's all of Tara you'll ever see. And Wilkerson says, you'll be sorry for that, and he drives off. And as he's driving off, we see Gerald kind of like lock in a little bit and realizes what has happened. And he gets on his horse and he goes flying after them. And in order to meet them around the sort of long curved driveway to head off the buggy, he has to go down sort of straight through the field. And he goes to jump the fence and the horse doesn't make it and he falls and dies. And he's buried next to Ellen and their 3 stillborn babies. So now Scarlett has to find a way to get the tax money. And she knows that Rhett has been arrested for some stolen Confederate gold. And so she's like, okay, I gotta go. And I gotta go and try to get this money out of Rhett. She knows that he has these feelings for her. And she's gonna do whatever she can. Scarlett, very shrewd. And she knows that she's gotta go looking good. She can't just roll up with her like tattered old dress. And so she rips down the curtains from the wall and has Mammy make her a dress. And she goes into the jail, and as she's going into the jail, she sees that Belle Watling is leaving the jail, and she just like absolutely gives this woman like an absolute like dirty look. She hates Belle, and she's trying to kind of lie and like get her way, get her money out of Rhett, but he says he doesn't have any money, and he discovers it, and he says, you've been working with your hands because they're all cracked in blood. And of course, at this time, like, women have very soft hands, are not doing any manual labor, especially not one of Scarlett's like status. And he has this thing, and he said, and she sort of comes clean and she says, I need these $300. And he says, what collateral are you offering? She says, my earbobs, so earrings. And he says, not interested. She says, mortgage on Tara. And he says, what would I do with a farm? And she says, you wouldn't live there. I'd just pay you back on next year's cotton. Rhett says, not good enough. Anything better? She said, you once said you loved me. If you still love me, Rhett. And Rhett says, you've forgotten I'm not a marrying man. Scarlett says, no, I haven't forgotten. And Rhett says, you're not worth $300. You'll mean nothing but misery to any man. And he says, so you see, my dear, you've abased yourself for no purpose. And he, talks about how everything's locked up in banks in England from his blockade running to protect it from the Yankees. She is so mad and she storms out. And may I remind you, she looks down on Belle Watling completely for being a sex worker. But offering your body for $300 is sex work. It's like, let's not do this here, Scarlett. So as they're driving away in the buggy to head back to Tara, Scarlett sees Frank Kennedy, and he has this general store and he's doing really well for himself. And he's saying that he's saving up for a wedding to Sue Ellen. And Scarlett gets an idea in her head. And she knows that Frank will give them the money, but Sue Ellen would not. So she decides that she's going to try to go after Frank Kennedy. And she just kind of slips her hand in his pocket. And then we cut back to Tara. Scarlett is completely decked out in nice clothes. Taxes have been paid, and Sue Ellen is freaking out, is completely inconsolable because she has stolen who was supposed to be her husband for many years. As a sister, like, I don't know. I look at like my sister's husbands and partners as like a pet, like not even like a man, like just like love them. They're like my brothers, but like, ugh, can't imagine. Ashley feels terrible about all this because he feels like Scarlett basically had to sell herself to get the money. She tries to help convince him to run the store, and she's going to buy these lumber mills with her money. Scarlett's very, very good with business. And he says, no, like we're going to go to New York. I want to, do this on my own. She kind of throws a tantrum, and Melanie agrees to do this with Scarlett because of how much she helped them and kind of kept them from starving. So Scarlett buys a mill, Ashley runs it, and Scarlett uses convict labor, and Ashley is horrified. So this is under the 13th Amendment. There's a really good documentary about it on Netflix, which is, we talk about systemic racism and how like slavery ended, but it shifted. And so it's something like the 13th Amendment, when we see these high levels of people of color in prisons because the police are there to protect the dominant class of people. And then, they're able to be exploited for their labor through once they are convicted. I'm doing a very, very light summary on that, but there's a very interesting documentary on Netflix about it. Ashley's kind of horrified this, and Scarlett basically says, like, whatever, like, I'm going to be ruthless and I'm never going to be poor, and I do not care what people think. And she says, I'm going to be friends with the Yankees and the carpetbaggers, and I'm going to beat them at their own game. And Frank is kind of horrified by Scarlett because she sort of lied about her little personality until they got married because, like, the boss bitch. And she then kind of reveals herself later to be this like strong-headed, strong-willed, you can't tell me shit kind of gal. And he wanted like a meek, quiet little housewife. And Scarlett begins to have this horrendous reputation in town because not only is she a woman that's running this business, because like, I mean, women, we have just very little brains in our head. How could we do this? But she's going out by herself. She's going out in these dangerous locations. She's selling. She is like the boss of all of this. And she's engaging with the Yankees, which everyone is horrified by as well. Rhett then pays her a visit, and he basically says, if you just waited like a little while, I would have had my millions. And he says, tell me, Scarlett, do you never shrink away from marrying men you don't love? And she says, you still think you're the belle of the county, don't you? That you're the cutest little trick in shoe leather and that every man you meet is dying of love for you. And she sort of brushes him off because he then accuses her of still being in love with Ashley Wilkes. And of course she is, but she's not going to tell him that because you don't want to admit that to him for him to have any sort of enjoyment out of that. And so she brushes him off and she's headed to the mill on her own. And he says, you're going through Shantytown alone. And she says, I can shoot straight if I don't have to shoot too far because she's got her gun with her. Scarlett is alone and is attacked by two men. In the book, I believe they're both black. They're described horrendously, or at least the one is. In the film, one is black and one is white. It's sort of implied that they are going to rape her. And all of a sudden, a former enslaved man that we meet like earlier comes to save her. And he actually is hiding out because he killed a Yankee for insulting him, and they sort of sneak him off to safety after that. So after all this, Scarlett is distraught, and they go to Melanie's. And the men go to a political meeting, is what they call it, but it's actually a KKK raid. The Yankee officers then show up at their house, asking for where they are. Melanie just says they're at a political meeting, and basically the Yankees camp out until they get back. The men come home absolutely obliterated drunk, we think. They stumble in and they basically said, we've been at Belle Watling's. All the women are, of course, horrified because this is, brothel, I guess. But this is actually a lie from Rhett to get the Yankees out of there because Ashley has been shot. Scarlett runs in to help Ashley and she's freaking out. Her husband is nowhere to be found. And as she's sort of crying over Ashley and worried about him, Rhett says, your husband's been shot. He's out on the Decatur Road. Later, Melanie tries to call on Belle Watling, and then Belle Watling comes out to their house to meet Melanie and basically says, like, you can't be associated me. Like, you're this like super respectable person and I do what I do. And Melanie says, no, like you helped save my husband. I have to thank you. It was then the funeral for Frank Kennedy and Rhett pays Scarlett a visit. Rhett is now seeing his opportunity to try and get Scarlett because she keeps, marrying men she doesn't love and he's trying to like get in there. Scarlett is crying because she feels like it's her fault that Frank is dead. Kind of is. She's afraid she's going to die and go to hell. And in the book, she's quite an alcoholic. We see her drinking in this a little bit, then proposes and she agrees to marry him. And she basically, Rhett says, do you love me? And she said, well, I am fond of you. If I said I was madly in love with you, you knew I'd be lying. And he says, I'm not in love with you any more than you are with me. Heaven help the man who ever really loves you. And they have this big, scandalous, gaudy wedding. And they build this giant house to make everyone jealous. Scarlett just wants to stick it to everyone in the town for being mean to her, and Rhett gives her this great big diamond. So they get married. They go off to New Orleans for their honeymoon. Scarlett sort of has these like PTSD flashbacks, and she wants to go to Tara. Rhett kind of babies Scarlett and pours all his attention and love into her. He helps her rebuild Tara to what it looked like pre-war, and then Mammy and Prissy come to work at the house. And Mammy describes them as mules in horse harnesses, which iconic. And I love, and Rhett actually quite enjoys that as well. Scarlett then gets pregnant with a girl, and she has a girl named Bonnie Blue, and Rhett sort of turns his love from Scarlett and his attention and sort of pours that all into Bonnie. Scarlett is very upset after this for numerous reasons, one of them being vanity. She can't get her waist into what it was pre-baby. In the book, this is her third baby because she actually has a baby with Frank as well. Catholics, no birth control. She basically says, like, I'm not going to have sex with you anymore because I don't want to get pregnant. And Rhett says, fine, and kind of figures this has to do with Ashley because he finds a little photo of Ashley that Scarlett still has. And he says, the world is full of many things and many people, and I shan't be lonely. I will find comfort elsewhere. Scarlett says that she is going to lock the door, and he says, why bother? If I wanted to come in, no lock could keep me out. And then he kicks the door open, breaks the lock, and then throws a glass of whiskey at a portrait of her. And now it becomes very clear that Bonnie is sort of the only thing that they have left together. And he sort of begins to repair his reputation in town through Bonnie because he doesn't want Bonnie to be sort of ostracized like the two of them have been. Scarlett then goes to check on one of the lumber mills with Ashley. This is before a surprise party he's supposed to have. And they get into a discussion, kind of reminiscing about the good old days. And then afterwards they hug, and Ashley's sister comes in, and Mrs. Mead, who were friends with Melanie, and sort of misconstrued it for them having an affair. And it is the talk of the town. Rhett obviously finds out, and Rhett confronts Scarlett, who's pretending to be sick to avoid the party. And he pulls her out of bed. And selects this like really low cut, scandalous red dress. And he says, you got to go look your part tonight. And he drops her off at the party and says, you got to go in alone. The lions are hungry for you. Melanie, because of her love for Scarlett, doesn't believe that there is this affair going on. And I mean, to be fair, there really isn't. It is an emotional affair, kind of. Every so often there's like a flare up, but it really isn't like this. Like Ashley hasn't like betrayed Melanie physically. And after the party, it's late at night, and Scarlett sneaks down to the first floor of their house from her bedroom because she wants to sneak a drink. And Rhett comes back in, and he's been drinking all night. And he says, of course, this comic figure in all this is the long-suffering Mr. Wilkes. Mr. Wilkes, who can't be mentally faithful to his wife, but won't be unfaithful to her technically. Why doesn't he make up his mind? And then as Scarlett's sitting there, he grabs either side of her. And, it starts to get, this is engaging in some domestic violence here. And she said, observe my hands, my dear. I could tear you into pieces with them, and I'd do it if I could take Ashley from your mind, but it wouldn't. So I'll remove him from your mind this way. I'll put my hands on either side of your head, and I'll smash your skull between them like a walnut. That should block him out. Rhett kind of has her cornered, and she says, you've lived in dirt so long, you can't understand anything else, and you're jealous of something you can never understand. He says, jealous am I? Yes, I suppose I am, even though you have been faithful to me all along. How do I know? Because I know Ashley Wilkes is an honorable breed. They're gentlemen. That's more than I can say for you and me. We're not gentlemen, and we have no honor. He then kisses her, and she kind of puts up a protest, and he grabs her pulls her up the stairs and he says, "This is one night, you're not going to lock me out." And in the book, they go into it in more detail. This kind of just fades to black, but this is a moment of marital rape. She wakes up in the morning. She's like sing-songing about all this and feels like very happy, which is kind of fucked up. They don't deep dive into the book about this. Like she just like wakes up feeling like in love, which is fucked up. And Rhett says, what happened last night shouldn't have happened. And he takes Bonnie to England. Bonnie has nightmares and wants to go back home. And this time while they're away, Scarlett discovers that she is pregnant. And she's actually happy that she is. And she can't wait to tell Rhett. He gets home and he said, kind of makes a joke about, who's the father. She argues with him. He says, "Cheer up, maybe you'll have an accident." Scarlett goes to hit him and falls down the stairs and does have a miscarriage and she almost dies. Again, there's not like much medical stuff. Dr. Mead she's hallucinating. It seems as though she maybe gets some sort of either severe blood loss that leads to confusion or some sort of infection that maybe has a bit of sepsis that clear. It's very unclear what it is, but she almost dies and Rhett feels horrible. Melanie comes over to sort of both comfort Rhett and be with Scarlett while she's sick. And this is where she reveals to Rhett that she is also pregnant. After Scarlett feels better, she's sort of resting and recovering and spending a lot of time outdoors and, watching Bonnie, who's got this little horse, jump over this thing. Rhett then wants to repair his relationship and he says, "Why don't we sell the mills to Ashley so we have more time to spend together?" And just as this is happening, Bonnie says, she's going to jump this jump and Rhett says, "No, you can't jump. Your pony's too small. Like, this isn't safe." And she says, I'm gonna jump, like, and the bar's higher. And Scarlett kind of looks over and she goes, "Ugh, just like Pa," like the same attitude. And then she sort of is horrified because as she is thinking this, Bonnie jumps over it. She's thrown from the horse, breaks her neck, just like Scarlett's father, and dies. And then there is like, they go in, again, like the book goes into greater detail. Like I was like sobbing through all of this part. Rhett is so grief stricken and he won't allow the body to be buried. He locks himself in the room and drinks and sits with her body until it's starting to sort of decay and they have to have a funeral for this. And this is the breakdown of Scarlett and Rhett's relationship, like absolutely completely. They're like screaming at each other, having these fights, blaming each other for the death, saying that, Rhett's saying that she was a horrible mother and, just throwing every insult. And Mammy calls on Melanie to help sort this out. And Melanie is able to console Rhett long enough that he lets her, release the body and then they bury Bonnie. And so Melanie is progressing through her pregnancy and it's very clear that Melanie is not going to make it. They don't go into it too much about whether or not she's dying in labor or maybe she's miscarried and the baby is dying and she's going septic. They don't go into it. But as she's dying, the only person she wants to talk to is Scarlett, and Dr. Mead pulls her aside and says, like, no deathbed confessions, basically being like, if you've had an affair with Ashley, like, now is not the time. So Melanie dies, and Ashley afterwards, says, "I can't live without her. I can't. Everything I ever had going was her. She's the only dream I ever had that didn't die in the face of reality." And Scarlett finally realizes that her infatuation with Ashley is completely childish, that they're so different, that she was in love with the idea of being in love with him more than him as the actual person. And she figures out that Rhett is the person she's supposed to be with. So Rhett, after seeing her comfort Ashley, is just like, "Fuck this, I'm out." And he leaves and she goes to find Rhett and he's packed up and he's walking away from the house and he says, "I'm leaving you, my dear, and all you need now is a divorce and your dreams of Ashley can come true." And Scarlett says, "I must have loved you for years. Only I'm such a stupid fool. I didn't know it. Please believe me. You must care. Melly said you did." Rhett says, "I believe you. And what about Ashley?" And Scarlett says, "I never really loved Ashley." And Rhett says, "You certainly made a good imitation up until this morning." "No, Scarlett, I've tried everything. If you only met me halfway when I came back from London." Scarlett says, "I was so glad to see you. I was, Rhett, but you were so nasty." And Rhett says, "And then you were sick and it was all my fault. I hoped against hope you'd call for me, but you didn't." And Scarlett said, I wanted you desperately, but I didn't think you wanted me." And Rhett says, "It seems we've been at cross purposes, doesn't it? But it's no use now. As long as there is Bonnie, there's still a chance we might be happy. I like to think Bonnie was you, a little girl again before the war and poverty and the things that were done to you. She was so like you, and I could pet her and spoil her as I wanted to spoil you. But when she went, she took everything." And Scott says, "Rhett, please don't say that. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." And Rhett says, "My darling, you're such a child. You think by saying I'm sorry that the past can be corrected. Here, take my handkerchief. Never in any crisis of your life have I known you to have a handkerchief." And she says, "Rhett, where are you going?" He says, "I'm going to Charleston, back where I belong." And Scarlett says, "Please take me with you." And Rhett says, "No, I'm through with everything. I want peace. I want to see if there's something left in this life of charm and grace. Do you know what I'm talking about? Scarlett says, no, I only know I love you. And Rhett says, that's your misfortune. And she says, Rhett, if you go, where shall I go? What shall I do? And he looks at her and he says, the most iconic line and the best film line of all time. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. And he leaves. And that's the end of Gone with the Wind. Hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you tuned into the 2 previous ones. Next week, I have a very exciting episode with my friend Tristan, who's the martial arts film freak, and we are deep diving Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Got some really fun guests coming up in the next month for you guys before we get into our summer of Scorsese. So thank you all again for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like, rate, subscribe, tell your friends, all that good stuff. I am trying to make this my job, and it's not going well. So please do all that. Again, I'm your host, Holly Holiday, and happy Tuesday.